Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with our webinar. The Mountain Plains Prevention Technology Transfer Center at the University of Utah is excited to welcome you to our 5-part webinar series, Scope of Prevention Along the Continuum of Care. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our website at pttcnetwork.org/Mountain Plains. Slides will be available in PDF format and posted on our website as well. For those of you interested in a certificate following today's webinar, please email mountainplains_pttc@utah.edu. We are an approved NAIADAC provider. For all other licensure and credentials, please apply directly to your board. All participants have been muted. We encourage you to use the chat feature for questions and messages. Following the webinar, you will see a link in the chat feature along with the QR code to complete a survey. The survey is required for all training events funded by Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. They want to know how well we provide our services, and we want your feedback to help us improve our trainings. The information you provide is confidential. We ask that you please take a few minutes to complete the Bhvr evaluation form. The purpose of this webinar series is to discuss strategies and interventions used to prevent substance use, decrease risk of if substance use has already occurred, as well as to discuss strategies for preventing relapse after treatment or during maintenance and recovery. Components of the Institute of Medicine's, or IOM, Behavioral Health Continuum of Care model will be highlighted and discussed throughout the webinar series. In this webinar series, we want to highlight that prevention can occur anywhere along the continuum of care, including during treatment and maintenance recovery. Before we dive into IOM's Continuum of Care model, we want to acknowledge that some of you may be familiar with slightly different prevention models, depending on the setting you work in. For those of you who participated in our last webinar series, we discussed some of the different prevention frameworks and models. For example, many of you are familiar with SAMHSA's Strategic Prevention Framework, which is more of a comprehensive framework or planning process to prevent substance use and misuse. However, some of you may also be familiar with the prevention triangle, which is often used in schools and other educational settings. We want to point out that all of these models are complementary rather than exclusive. Many of you may be familiar with IOM Mental Health Intervention Spectrum model published in 1994 that offers a framework for addressing behavioral health, including substance use disorders. This model begins with promotion, then prevention, treatment, and maintenance recovery across the continuum, while recognizing that promotion also occurs across the entire continuum. Today's webinar will focus on promotion, while other webinars in this series focus on other components of the IOM continuum. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. A graduate of Wichita State University, majoring in marketing and communications, Holly has been working with Hot Pink Inc. since 1994. She has been instrumental in a number of successful public relations campaigns, coordination, creation, refurbishment, and management of national, regional, and local brands and campaigns. Holly serves as the primary account executive and planner for the South Dakota Department of Health Tobacco Control Program, Healthy South Dakota Nutrition and Physical Activity Program, the Maternal Child Health Program, and the Opiate Abuse and Misuse Prevention and Public Education Campaign. Prevention has been the focus of her work for the last 10 years. It is my pleasure to turn the time over to Holly Riker.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So I think you can go to that next slide here. We'll get started right away. I'm really excited to be here, being able to talk to you about how to implement a prevention and media campaign. And if you want to go to that next slide, it will. So with prevention campaigns, there's always going to be some level of behavior change involved. And changing behavior can be very challenging. So the first thing that we need to be really clear about when we're embarking on something like this is the type of marketing that we're doing, because there are some significant differences between commercial marketing and health marketing and the strategies and tactics that work when it comes to campaign approach and overall messaging. And I happen to have a list of some of the differences between commercial and health marketing with me. It's on the next slide, we'll get to that. But in general, marketing itself is rooted in communication. It is the foundation for communication, and that comes, what comes into play there is building relationships. So really important to understand our audience and who we're talking to. Equally important is determining what type of relationship that we want to have with our audience, and then what type of relationship we actually have with our audience. If we aren't honest about that going into the campaign planning process, or if you haven't kind of done a double check on that, there's a good chance that you can be sending out a message that isn't something that the audience is going to relate to, isn't something that they need to hear. And then they won't respond to it, and then you're left wondering why your campaign didn't work. In terms of audience, there's also some different parameters or rules of engagement depending on who you're talking to and what role you're playing in the relationship. For example, you will know moms and daughters communicate very differently than a doctor and a patient communicate, or a peer group, peer-to-peer communication. So it's important to make sure that we know what role we are playing in that relationship. And then once we have done those things, we have to also figure out how we're going to reach our audience. What media platforms do they use? Where do they get their information? Who do they trust? What are those go-to sources for them? Media platforms, brands, campaigns, those are things that can all be used as tools to reach audiences and remind them of the messages and the information that we have to share for them, but it also reinforces those relationships. So the more we know about our audience, the easier it's going to be to build relationships and communicate with them. And of course, a good way to get to know your audience is to actually talk to them and include them in your planning process. And so while we're at it, we also like to be thinking about who else might be willing to be on our team, who else we can invite to the table to collaborate on our prevention efforts, because behavior change is a big job. So up next is the list that I promised. Yeah, so commercial versus health marketing. Commercial marketing essentially is persuading audiences to start doing something. We want you to buy a product. We want you to use this service or visit this location. It's pretty obvious, and from a marketing standpoint, it's the easy job. We are basically going to take all of the best things about the product or the service, and we're going to talk about those and promote those things. Health marketing, on the other hand, is often about not starting something, or if you have dabbled in something, to please stop doing that. And it is certainly the harder assignment. So just to be clear, prevention messaging falls under that health marketing umbrella. It is much harder to talk someone out of doing something that they enjoy, or something that they turn to when they're stressed or out of habit. Something that their peers are doing, something that they are addicted to. That whole brain chemistry thing can be quite a challenge right off the bat for us. So with prevention efforts, and often with behavioral health efforts and messaging, we have some challenges to deal with right away, which can include things like addiction, like I said, substance abuse, physical dependence, but also emotional connections. For example, if you're trying to talk to a diabetic about the foods that they should be avoiding, there's an emotional connection that we have with food that can be a tough one to overcome. With smoking cessation, for example, the idea of losing their freedom or their independence to make their own decisions about their own lives and their lifestyle can also be a difficult barrier to overcome. So basically, prevention is the biggest, hardest job of all. And that's not a very positive way of starting things off today, which is why I want to talk a little bit more about a couple of really important words. So let's talk about what happens when we say no. I like to say that toddlers and teenagers are proof that saying no rarely works. At a minimum, in the marketing and advertising world, leading with no is kind of a tough sell. We borrow from psychologists and from psychology studies fairly often. Our marketing and advertising theory and principle overlaps with that quite a bit. And we look to their body of research often to reinforce some of the strategies that we employ. And there's a good deal of information out there on what happens when we as human beings hear the words yes or no. And both are very powerful, but there are some differences that are very worthy of note and apply then to messaging, the advertising that you do, and the communication that you have with your audiences. So yes is overall pretty positive. It's an affirmation, it's inclusion, it's courage, it supports some of that risk taking. So yes can be a great word, and we use it whenever we can, but more often than not in prevention, the trigger word for us is no, stop. So that's a fairly cold and abrupt end to a conversation. It's rarely celebrated. It's easily misunderstood. If you can think of some of those text messages that went terribly wrong for you. So neuroscience really supports what we already know about the word no. It registers faster and many times more harshly than we may have intended. And we are literally hardwired to respond to no more intensely and more persistently. So from a brain standpoint, no is really a stronger word than yes. But all is not lost. No can work for us when it's used in the context of clear choice. So for example, when we say things like, I will not because this is not my truth, or count me out because I am not comfortable, not in agreement, not on the bandwagon with. These things can empower us. When no is used to acknowledge personal responsibility, when people say no to drinking, drugs, or texting while driving because those things keep us safe and they protect the people around us, that can confirm our love and our respect and the value of the relationships that we have with people, our parents, our doctors, our teachers, even law enforcement, when we are acknowledging those things. And it can also be used to keep us true to our values and principles. And when we use it that way, it's a beautiful thing, right? It can protect us from exploitation, from abuse. It can keep us focused on our goals. It can be a strength when we need to change course, which comes up often in behavioral health situations. And so no can essentially make a yes stronger. So they're both powerful words. So what I would say is don't lose heart. We can use the power of no for good, in spite of the fact that health marketing is by definition a harder assignment, and prevention efforts can be pretty challenging. So we have to really remember that the work that we're doing is good work, and there are many other people out there supporting our efforts and doing work alongside us. And we know that prevention work does save lives. It does make a difference. We have proof in data trends. We can measure impact at local levels, but it does take some time, and we have to keep working at it because prevention work is never done. As soon as we get our message across to one audience, the next audience comes along and needs to be educated and informed. So in that way, it's kind of job security, which I guess is a good thing. And so I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. I want to talk some more about who we're trying to reach with our prevention efforts. And before I go into too much detail, I want to just take a second real quick. And if you could just think of what is a favorite commercial. I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, so what came up for you when you were thinking about that? Usually what comes to mind is something that you connected with emotionally. It either made you laugh or it got you all teared up, or it was memorable because you could relate to it somehow. And there's a good chance that whatever commercial you thought of that moved you might not have the same effect on your spouse or your kids or your grandkids and vice versa. So the point is that the best commercials and campaigns and messages are the ones where the audience has been taken into consideration. It also helps to have a $40 million budget. If you have one, you should let me know. We could talk. I don't often get to deal with budgets that big. But seriously, in order to build relationships, it's really important to understand our audience and how they receive information. So let's talk a little bit about prevention audiences specifically. Prevention, by its nature, is geared towards younger audiences because there's hope for them to not make the same mistakes that we did, right? And then there's also typically some common characteristics that make prevention efforts a little bit more urgent. If you've studied your YRBS data, you know that younger audiences are often risk takers. They are defiant just because they can be. They often don't have enough information or experience to make really good decisions. So the bad decisions that they make at an early age can have really lasting and powerful consequences. And then when you add to that things like disparate characteristics, lower income, lower education, people with less access to information, maybe there's overlapping chronic conditions, disabilities, mental health concerns. Then we have geography that comes into play, rural populations where services are sparse or not consistent. This is where it becomes really important to build that ongoing communication with your audience and build trust. That can really make a difference in some of those situations. Secondary audiences, really important because they help reinforce our messages. Usually the primary audience members trust the secondary audience members, or at least they trust them when things get serious. So you may have young adults or adolescents who will go to their parents or to their healthcare provider. So making sure that you've got backup in that secondary audience is really important. So generally speaking, in terms of prevention, this is kind of broad buckets, groups of people who we are talking to, but what do we know specifically about them? And this is where my job gets really fun. So for quick reference point, there's the silent generation, people born between 1925 and 1945. The baby boomers, a well-known group born between 1946 and 1964. And my sisters and brothers in Generation X, we were all born between 1965 and 1985. But for our talk today, we're going to focus on the next two generations because they are more likely to be part of prevention efforts. And we're going to start with the millennials, or what is sometimes known as the me generation. In general, the millennials are between the ages of 25 and 37. These age ranges for all of the groups can vary a little bit depending on who you ask, and then also who's in those groups. If they were born at the very beginning of a generation or at the very end, they may identify with one or the other. And so these age ranges are kind of loose. But this group is important because many of them fall into our prevention audience. They are women of childbearing age, young adults, parents, young families. They're making some really important decisions about health and mental health and overall health for themselves as well as for their family. So this is a really busy slide. I have to disclaim that up front. But I do want to call out a few important characteristics of this group. They are right now in the United States the largest portion of adults in our population. Overall, they are pretty well educated, although there are some sharp differences between the financial well-being of those with college degrees and those without. In this group, everyone works and everyone is co-parenting. That's kind of a norm. That is something that is distinctly different about this audience than generations past. And then something that can be really helpful in prevention messaging with this group is that they tend to seek products and services that align with their beliefs. So if we can combine some of our messaging to sort of reinforce some of those things that they already have strongly believe in, that can usually work to our advantage. So how do we reach them? What kind of strategies can we use to make our messaging more impactful? Well, they are very well connected on social media, so that is one place to start. This group requires short, clear chunks of information. As I said, they are working, they are parents, they do not have a lot of time to really read through things, so they want the information to be clear and short. They also want to have their facts backed by science. We do not have to shove it down their throat, but they do want to make sure, and they will check our references. So make sure that you include those. Also, again, because they are so busy, what is in it for me? What's in it for my family? Why is this important? Why do I need to know this? When you answer those types of questions in your messaging, it will go a lot further. Also unique to this group is the fact that they feel a responsibility to share their feedback. So if you ask their opinion, which can be really helpful at every stage of a campaign, in the planning portion, when you have launched something, and afterwards, they will offer their feedback, and that can be super helpful. Another thing that's really helpful with this audience is that they have a certain group of influencers that they believe, that they value, that they're going to for recommendations, and if you can entrust or get some of those people to carry your message, that can also be really, really beneficial with any campaign. So that is the millennials in broad strokes. And now let's talk about my kids. I have 3 children, all of whom are part of the iGen or Generation Z cohort. So not only do I get to research and talk about this group, I get to live it every single day. And I can tell you a couple things about this group. They're very interesting. They are overall still discovering who they are. Their story is only partially written as of right now, but there are a few things that we have been able to see and identify about this group as a whole. So these kids are roughly between the ages of 13 and 24. They are the adolescents and the young adults, so they're going to make up a pretty big percentage of the prevention primary target audience. And they are really making those of us in marketing and advertising work for our money. Some of the standard marketing and advertising strategies and tactics that we have used for decades with great results simply do not work with this group. Part of that probably has to do with the fact that they have literally been immersed in technology since birth. This is the first audience that doesn't know what it was like before the internet. So they make up a huge percentage of our population, bigger than the baby boomers. So they are going to be a force to be reckoned with. So it is imperative that we find ways to communicate with this audience effectively. Couple of unique characteristics. This group has absolutely zero tolerance for inequality. They are the you do you, no judgment generation. That makes collaboration with them very easy. And it's a go-to for them in terms of how they communicate with each other, but it can also make decision-making harder for them. No one wants to be the one to have the final say. No one wants to finally be the one to make the decision. They do better in group settings. Something else, especially in terms of behavioral health, this group is experiencing unprecedented levels of depression, suicide, and mental health issues. Some of that could be due to the fact that they have been exposed to so much information so early. When you have access to the history of everything and to the worldwide news and updates every single day since you have been born, that can make you a little weary of your environment. So I would say, that is something that we really need to pay attention to with this group. Something else that I have to remind myself of every single day is that they are wicked smart multitaskers. They have been honing their tech skills from day one. So when they are on their phone and texting or not looking at you and not making eye contact, don't necessarily count them out for not hearing what you're saying. They have a skill set that is different than some of the older generations, so be mindful of that. So how do we reach these kids? Again, social media is here to stay. This group has enormous networks and relationships with people, companies, brands, causes all over the world on social media. That is where they live. And there's a saying in advertising, if you want to sell hats, go where the heads are. And so that's what we are doing with this group. We really try to make sure that we've got those bases covered on social media. They are similar to the millennials in that they want short, bite-sized chunks of information with facts, and they will call you out and verify that information if you don't have it as part of your messaging. Some other good strategies to use are to emphasize things that include them. When something is safer for everyone, when it benefits everyone, when you can frame that in a how-to, a steps for, or reasons why type of messaging. When we invite this group to weigh the information instead of telling them, this is right, this is wrong, this is yes, this is no, that when we're allowing them to make some of the decision based on the information we're providing, we will get much better results. And I have an example of a prevention campaign aimed at this audience that we did just recently, or we launched just recently, but we've been working on it for a while. So when, a little background for you, when the Surgeon General came out with the initial report on e-cigarettes, I think it was back in 2014, those of us that had been working in tobacco control for a while were pretty sad because the language was kind of wishy-washy. What they said was e-cigarettes might be okay if they're used exclusively for cessation and if you're an adult, and they're probably safer than combustible cigarettes. So it was a little wishy-washy, and those of us that have been doing this work for a while could really see the train wreck coming. There's no regulation, there's a lot of flavors, this is a shiny new product. People were pretty convinced that the vapor was harmless, and kids all over the place were using their e-cigarette pens to blow all kinds of shapes and sizes of vapor rings. And then came Juul in 2017, and it was just a complete nightmare for us. So everyone in public health, from the CDC down, was playing catch up in terms of trying to validate the research. So we did the only thing that we could afford at the state level, which was focus groups. And a real quick note about focus groups, they aren't statistically accurate, but they can really provide a lot of sentiment. They can give insight on how to reach different audiences, how to frame messaging, how to provide context for making that emotional connection that you need to make in order to change behavior. And then they can also support the measuring and the success of your campaign. So if you can't afford a big research project, focus groups are a good idea at the front end or the middle or even the back end, just to kind of help move those things along. So for this, this campaign, we focus grouped both teens and parents. And from the sessions, we were able to get a really good sense of how much misinformation was out there around this topic, and some of the triggers that were really pushing everybody's buttons. So we really had to avoid mentioning things like it's illegal. That was beside the point. Everybody was doing it and nobody really cared about the legality of it. We also downplayed the fact that the vape companies are owned by the tobacco companies and that they're just back to their same old tricks that they did 30 years ago. As far as this audience is concerned, they don't really care. This is a new company, it's a new product, they're completely separate. They want everybody to have their own opportunity to sell their products, and they want to make their own decisions. So kind of dwelling on that didn't really do us any good. We also downplayed comparing to cigarettes. This generation of kids does not see the similarities. They are two separate products. They already think cigarettes are gross. So that didn't resonate at all with them. So instead we had to emphasize other arguments, the brain damage, the highly addictive nature of nicotine, and how quickly you can be overloaded with the nicotine. So really what we had to do was provide the facts. We gave them the studies, the sources, as you can see. Well, I'm not sure if you can see from this little tiny image here, but down at the bottom there on that orange panel, there's a list of the different sources. And we really had to acknowledge with this group that here's some facts, here's the studies, here's what we do know, but we don't have 30 years worth of research and trend data proving how deadly these products are just yet. So it was a compromise. I also want to talk about priority populations here, because they usually will have a unique set of circumstances and challenges that can make traditional messaging or tactics less effective, or you might have to change your strategies just a little bit. So for example, in South Dakota, over 42% of our American Indian population is still smoking commercial cigarettes. And that is more than double the rate of other adult populations in our state. So it's still a really big problem for us. Why is that? Well, this group has a completely different set of risk factors. They have lower levels of education. They have high levels of poverty. Both of those things can lead to high stress levels. The tobacco industry specifically targets them and markets their products to say that it's a stress relieving tool. So they're exploiting their culture. There's lots of exposure for these guys to smoking and secondhand smoke. It is a normal part of their day-to-day. They start smoking at an earlier age. And because of their physical characteristics, they metabolize nicotine faster than other ethnic groups, which leads to higher levels of dependence. So we have all of these things that kind of come into play that maybe don't necessarily affect other populations. So it's really important to do your homework when it comes to different audiences, and be prepared to change course or modify slightly, and be patient. When we first developed this Find Your Power campaign, it's 10 years going, so it was 10 years ago. We focus grouped. We talked to grandmothers, teens, parents. We had to understand their culture. And we had to admit that maybe smoking wasn't the biggest problem that they had to face. So how can we work our message into their culture and into their lives? So it was that relationship building that really became important. So 10 years later, this is one of our most successful campaigns and by far our most engaged audience. They really appropriated the brand and have been driving the messaging ever since. So prevention messaging that is empathetic and acknowledges the lived experience of those audiences is going to be much more effective for you. So let's talk a little bit about secondary audiences. They are not less important than our primary audiences, but they do play a different role, and there are different ways to reach them. They can be an audience in and of themselves. Sometimes they need to be caught up to speed. For example, we had to do some work with our providers in our state to get them up to speed on vape devices and consequences. But they can also be key informants and supporters and advocates and partners as we go along. So how do we reach them? Well, we tend to think of our secondary audiences in terms of who we want on our team. This can be providers, community leaders, parents, teachers, coalition, even staff within your own organization or another division within your own organization. Sometimes it's important and can be very helpful to have everybody saying the same thing and giving the same messaging out there. So how do you get their support? Well, you ask. You show them that your efforts are going to align. You make sure that they understand how important their support is and be clear about what you want it to do, and of course make it easy for them. But before you do that, you should check to make sure that they haven't been doing this work already. There is nothing worse than giving your big sales pitch only to find out that they've already got a prevention campaign in place. So do your homework and then ask for their involvement and figure out ways that your support and their support is going to align and be good for everyone. So important to remember for you, as well as to remind them that their information and their input is really valuable. People trust doctors, counselors, teachers, law enforcement, grandmothers. They may not realize that. And then if you can get a small group of those people to be supportive of your cause, then they can also feed the communication networks, because other people are going to check with them. So the one doctor will check with another doctor, hey, have you heard about this? Teachers, same thing. They're going to check with their peers to find out if your prevention efforts are indeed agreeable to the entire group. So make sure that everyone is on board and everyone understands what is going on. It is not uncommon in large organizations or communities for the left hand to not know what the right hand is doing. We're all busy. I was just at a conference on maternal child health earlier this year, and one of the subjects that came up was what happens when kids turn 18 from a medical standpoint. Who gets to see their records? Who gets to make the decisions when it comes to their health care? And in some of those discussions, there was a lot of confusion. Parents weren't aware of it. Kids weren't aware of it. They didn't know how to navigate those systems. Front desk people were uninformed as to what to do with an angry parent. So getting some of those things out on the table early can really help later, making your efforts known to make sure we're all on the same page. So I have talked a lot about knowing who your audiences are, how they receive their information, and what role they can play. All of those things are really critical on the front end to the success of your campaign. So again, involving everyone early and making sure that you're doing this legwork with your audiences before the campaign launches. It can be really difficult sometimes to stop the creative ideas early on that you have, because you know this work and you know this information and this is what message you want to send, but really inviting everyone to be involved early and taking them serious and taking their advice and their input into account before you do that. Not only will it help your message overall, it will generate positive word of mouth. It will legitimize your efforts within their networks, and they will often do this work free of charge for you. So budgets are always a concern, and wherever we can get input and advice directly from the audience, the better. The help me help you, what's in it for you, what's in it for me. One thing that you need to be aware of is it's really nice when you have budget and you think that, oh, this is great, we finally have enough money for a TV campaign. But in talking to your audience, you realize that what they really need is a fact sheet or some talking points or an online form on your website or some incentives or some training. So even though you'd really like to do the TV campaign, maybe there are some pieces and parts that your audiences need or your supporters need before you get to that step. If you're not sure what they need, ask them. There's often times where we have been really surprised by some of the really easy things that we could do and really inexpensive things that we could do that we didn't think of. So make sure you talk to them. And then in terms of thinking about what you need, do you need interviews, testimonials, hosts for events, roundtables, sponsors, people to recruit other people for you? Those folks in the iGen Generation Z network, they are Instagram influencers, and they can really help you get your message out there. So be mindful of all of those types of things, prioritize your common goals, and be clear about your objectives as you go. So now we are finally to the point, a part of the presentation where we can talk about how to implement a successful campaign. And I like to frame this in kind of a recipe suggestions here. So the first thing that you do is you make your shopping list, right? You are not the only one in your organization doing your part to save the world here. So we really have to be realistic. There are many of us working toward these same goals, and you can only do what you can do with the funds you have, the time frame that's given, and with the members on your team. So be realistic about that, and then be sure that your goals align with sources and entities that can afford to do the research. If you can't, even if you can do your own research, make sure you are aligning with some of those state objectives or the national trend data, because you will likely need to reference that to justify your ongoing efforts. And then, as I've been talking for the entire presentation today, team members. Who is part of your primary audience, your secondary audience? What you're shopping for are those people who can be part of the team and whose efforts line up with your goals. That can be local coalitions, community groups, youth organizations, parents, churches, businesses. All of those things come into play. And for those on the call today that are left-brained, I'm sorry, but I will have to say, be creative. I know people can get tired of hearing that phrase, but partners really can show up in unexpected ways. For example, there might be a Parks and Rec archery program out there that is really willing to align with underage drinking efforts. They could do take a shot in the dark free class as an alternative to those keggers on Friday nights. So not only are you looking for people who are willing to do the same work as you, but also some of those things that might come up in an unexpected way. Another thing that is a good idea to do is to combine funding if you can. A lot of times what you do with your funding once you get it is kind of up to you. And I can say that there's a lot of good things that can be done with small amounts of money, but a $20,000 campaign will buy a lot more media and have much more impact than 4 $5,000 campaigns. So if you can get a couple of partners to sort of chip in and to everybody say the same thing, show the same images, focus during the same time frame, you're going to have a much better chance of breaking through that clutter. And I have to tell you that the bad guys always have way bigger budgets than we do. So the more that you can condense and consolidate, the better off your campaign will be. Also checking with marketing firms. Some of them will be willing to do some or all pro bono work. They are probably not shouting that from the rooftops, but if you can go in and ask them to help, you have an enormous group of people that can really give you some very helpful insight and some creative ideas. Schools, another group that are always supporters of prevention efforts, high schools or colleges. They might have classes that are looking for semester projects. They may have kids that need to do community outreach. There might be a researcher who is looking for a thesis. So all of those things can be helpful as you're thinking about your project from beginning to end. Also, television and radio stations they are required by law to provide a certain percentage of public service messaging, which is great. And you can go to them and ask them for some assistance there, and they will likely respond and give you some information, or place your TV or place your radio. It might be at 2 o'clock in the morning. So one strategy that we use is to give them a little bit of budget so that you can have them help with some of that work, and also maybe have a say in where those ads are placed during the day parts. So once you've made your shopping list, then it's time to check the pantry for ingredients that you might already have. And again, piggybacking, kind of looking to see what is already out there. Unlike commercial campaigns that are copyrighted or trademark protected and things that you can't use, the advantage to public service is that there is a lot of professional materials and information out there that you can use or modify, sometimes at little or no cost. But be sure that you're asking and giving a courtesy heads up if you want to leverage or modify one of those campaigns. That'll help with your efforts as you go along. And then there's nothing like a good 20-minute Google search with a really well thought out list of keywords. That can give you a lot of insight as to what is already out there, what's working. You can take pieces and parts from other people's media libraries, advocacy tools or toolkits, and that can go a long way towards reducing some of the effort that you have to put forth or reinventing the wheel. And then, of course, the power of social media is really in its community. It can be completely your PR arm of your campaign. Those shout outs and hashtags really give incentive. They give credit where credit is due and strengthen your message. It makes everybody feel partnership. So those things are really helpful as you go forward with your campaigns. There any local efforts that you can kind of align with, those things are likely to be fairly popular within news feeds and on a local level and can make a really big difference. I have an example of a local effect that we were not expecting, and we do this all the time, so even for us there are surprises. So we were gearing up to launch our Avoid Opioid campaign, and we had created a set of materials, getting ready to place a pretty good size television broadcast buy statewide. And we decided to post our TV spots to the Facebook page ahead of that, just as kind of a, making sure all the bases were covered. We did not promote these TV spots on Facebook in any way. And for those of you that don't know, we typically don't consider Facebook the best platform for videos, especially if you want somebody to really see your whole message and watch the whole thing. Anything longer than 30 seconds is probably not going to get a ton of views, full views on Facebook. YouTube is really your go-to for that. But in this case, we were just placing these videos on our page just kind of as a rounding everything out. We're going to launch this campaign. You can see the TV and you can see it on Facebook. And what happened in the weeks ahead of our broadcast flight was that our average video views skyrocketed. We had a tremendous amount of engagement. And what resulted was a 3,300% organic reach in these videos, which is just absolutely outstanding. And also a little bit unexpected and scary for us because we weren't really anticipating that. But what happened was our little group of page followers shared it, and then those people shared it again, and then those people shared it again. And it just kind of went on and on. And what was good about it was that we had done our homework on our audience here. And even though CDC had some outstanding testimonials, we knew that our South Dakota audiences were going to be more likely to connect with South Dakota stories. So because these people were real people from our state with real stories and real families, it just spread throughout our state and was really a welcome sign that everyone was ready to talk about this really important issue. So now that you have checked your recipe, got all of your ingredients, you've done all of this legwork, we're ready to cook here, right? You understand your audiences, you have a really good idea of what messages are going to resonate with them. You've researched your partners and have a good idea of how your efforts can align. And you've defined your objectives really clearly. And I would just say, make sure that you don't forget what those are. Come back to them weekly or daily sometimes to make sure that you're on track. It can get really easy to lose sight of where you're at when you're in the middle of something, in the middle of a campaign. So monitor everything. I think that is going to be the focus of the next little bit of the presentation here, but it's really, really important to stay on track and monitor as we go. So how do we know things are working? Measurement, document, reporting. It is not glamorous, but it keeps the funds coming. And a pro tip is that we have found the one with the best report wins. So the more you document and the more that you keep everybody in the loop, the easier it is to keep the efforts ongoing. So perspective. The bad news is, and we have talked about this a little bit today, that prevention is kind of tough to measure. You cannot know how many people you prevented from becoming a statistic with your campaign until you have years and years of data. So that awareness takes time. Perceptions are difficult to change, and even the CDC will say, you know, you're in this for the long haul. Education is ongoing. It is worthy, but it is ongoing. And unfortunately, you know, we are probably not going to affect trend data with our $10,000 or even $100,000. But what we can do is we can measure along the way what we are doing at the local or regional level. So the good news is, when it comes to measuring, that there are lots of basics to measure. There's a ton of social media metrics, reach, frequency, impressions, engagement, comments, shares, likes, all of those things are helpful. Be sure to keep track of geography and population, because those things will just reinforce your smaller budgets. You don't have to tell the entire world, you need to tell the people in your community. Social media also allows you to segment those populations based on lifestyle and preference. So you can be really specific with your targeting and then be really specific with your budget. So you don't have to spend a whole bunch of money on a whole bunch of people that don't really or aren't going to be thinking about your messaging, or it doesn't apply to them. Broadcast media, if you have the budget for that, is great, and they have some very established metrics, so make sure that you are getting reach and frequency and gross rating points from your media buyers so that you can include that in your reports. I mentioned already the public service announcements from broadcast stations, but if you can get them to give you a buy one, get one free, if you give them a little bit of budget and they give you something in return, that also really resonates well with CDC and some of our project managers that we always have to check with. So again, documenting and reporting everything, even if it doesn't seem like it's that consequential. How many flyers did you hand out, or how many were delivered? How many events did you coordinate? What was the response from the community? If you've gotten a positive response, or if you have great feedback or dialogue going on in your social media networks, make sure that you get those testimonials from those people and include that with your reports. It's great to have numbers, but the meaning really comes from those emotional connections. So keep track of all of that information, the community involvement, and emphasize those small successes. One other challenge when you have limited budget that can be useful, we had a breastfeeding initiative that was started in one small community that went really, really well. And so we decided to take that statewide, and we challenged other communities in that region to embrace the breastfeeding workplace initiative in the same way that the first town did. So we pitted each town and each community against one another. Our budgets were small, and the effect was fantastic. So, so really using those social networks to make sure that you are leveraging every opportunity that you can. And be sure to give those people who engage and those organizations that adopt your messaging a pat on the back, a thank you, and make sure that they know that their efforts are appreciated. So next up, sustaining your efforts. How do we do that? Keeping your eye on the prize. Again, it all comes back to building those relationships. Communication can be exhausting sometimes, but if you are taking your time and thinking things through on the front end, doing all of that legwork, it's usually worth the payoff. It takes time to turn those battleships. It can take years to build trust within an audience, or to reinforce those core messages in a community, so be patient. The more you build in that constant communication, the better your end result will be. And then don't forget to plan what's coming up. Not only what we're doing right now, but where do we want to be in 2 years and 5 years. I've mentioned already kind of staying alert, keeping in touch with those boots on the ground, setting up ways that you're getting constant feedback, just comparing notes, checking goals, adjusting, reassessing as you go. And then asking, going back to that power of no. It is much harder to say no when you've been making progress in your field, when you have been able to prove community support. It is harder to say no when you are aligned with evidence-based campaigns and using those established metrics. Whew, that is a lot of things that we have covered today. So I'm going to take a breath and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Holly. So just a reminder for everyone, use the chat feature for questions you have. It looks like we did have one question during the presentation from Mario. She asked, how can you youth to buy into that there is something in it for them when you ask for their inclusion and collaboration? So,
well, I will say just flat out, bribery is the first step. We work with a number of youth groups and youth organizations, and you know, we invite them to have some discussions with us, and we feed them. We have some incentive items that we make sure that they get. So that's usually kind of an icebreaker. If you can afford to do a few things like that, it's really helpful. Coffee, they like to meet at the coffee places with their own groups. So if you can start those conversations, you don't need a huge group. But if you can get a couple of kids to come to something like that, then they'll tell their friends, and then they'll tell their friends. And also, again, going back to not just bombarding them with a bunch of information, but asking them how they feel about this. Did you know this? What do you think of this? So when you get them to come to the table, you know, really involve them and ask them what they think. I think those are the first steps.
Thanks. There is another question from Sigrid. Have you implemented positive community norms campaigns? If so, what have been your outcomes?
Positive community norms campaigns. I think we do this. We do this through our smaller youth groups and organizations. We have tobacco control representatives that kind of have regional duties, and they're really the ones that do more of that outreach. We provide more of the support. I think that this is an important distinction between your campaign when you're promoting something. Messages and campaigns and the media, the social media, broadcast media, those things really work better with a bigger audience. They're more of an education, but the social norms and creating that good vibe on the community level really needs to be face-to-face. So that's where you want to call in your secondary audiences and get the support from them. We have seen with our opioid work here, one of the doctors that provides MAT services in our state has been super instrumental in really kind of rallying the troops in terms of the other doctors. So you kind of have to find your champions to help you with that, but I think that work is face-to-face.
Awesome, thanks. We just have time for one more question from Sarah. She asked, do you have any suggestions for how to use a current existing social media platform to run multiple health messages at one time effectively?
I don't, because social media messages are really small. If you have one platform, you can, and you break your things, your topics down into small bite-sized chunks. You can run them all on one Facebook page, but you might need to be mindful of who you're aiming those messages at. So if you have nutrition information on a page and one of your primary audiences is people with diabetes, you want to see what you can do to aim those paid messages at that smaller group. If they do happen to come to your page and see physical activity, or substance use or substance abuse or other topics on there, that's okay, but you want to keep it short and sweet. One post, one message. Do not try to lump all of those things together. You can break it up in the back end by making sure that you're just aiming those specific messages at audiences that are going to need to hear that. So little chunks, little bites.
Perfect. Thanks, Holly. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. So for those of you that have a QR code app, you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can click the link that's in the chat box to do our post-evaluation survey with the option of completing a 30-day follow-up survey. You could also find our recorded past webinars on our website, which is pttcnetwork.org/Mountain Plains. Yeah, thanks again, Holly, everyone. Have a great day.